Chapter 10 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 10. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Warren Cotty, Gurnee, Illinois. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 10, by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 10, The Fall of the Rebel Capital. Since the visit of Blair and the return of the rebel commissioners from the Hampton Roads Conference, no event of special significance had excited the authorities or people of Richmond. February and March passed away in the routine of war and politics, which at the end of 4 years had become familiar and dull. To shrewd observers in that city, things were going from bad to worse. Stevens, the Confederate vice president, had abandoned the capital and the cause and retired to Georgia to await the end. Judge John A. Campbell, though performing the duties of Assistant Secretary of War, made, among his intimate friends, no concealment of his opinion that the last days of the Confederacy had come. The members of the rebel Congress, adjourning after their long and fruitless winter session, gave many indications that they never expected to reassemble. A large part of their winter's work had been to demonstrate, without direct accusation, that it was the Confederate maladministration which was wrecking the Southern cause. On his part, Jefferson Davis prolonged their session a week to send them his last message, a dry lecture to prove that the blame rested entirely on their own shoulders. The last desperate measure of rebel statesmanship, the law to permit masters to put their slaves into the Southern armies to fight for the rebellion, was so palpably illogical and impracticable that both the rebel Congress and the rebel President appeared to have treated it as the merest legislative rubbish. Or else the latter would scarcely have written in the same message, after stating that much benefit is anticipated from this measure, that the people of the Confederacy can be but little known to him who it supposes it possible they would ever consent to purchase, at the cost of degradation and slavery, permission to live in a country garrisoned by their own negroes and governed by officers sent by the conqueror to rule over them. Jefferson Davis was strongly addicted to political contradictions, but we must suppose that even his cross-eyed philosophy, capable of detecting that a Negro willing to fight in slavery in preference to fighting in freedom, was not a very safe reliance for Southern independence. The language, as he employs it here, fitly closes the continuous official Confederate wail about Northern subjugation, Northern despotism, Northern barbarity, Northern atrocity, and Northern inhumanity, which rings through his letters, speeches, orders, messages, and proclamations with monotonous dissonance during his whole 4 years of authority. Of all the Southern people, none were quite so blinded as those of Richmond. Their little bubble of pride at being the Confederate capital was ever iridescent with the brightest hopes. They had no dream that the visible symbols of Confederate government upon which their eyes had nourished their faith would disappear almost as suddenly as if an earthquake had swallowed them. Poverty, distress, and desolation had indeed crept into their homes, but the approach had been slow and mitigated by the exaltations of a heroic self-sacrifice. All accounts agree that when, on Sunday morning, April 2, 1865, the people of Richmond went forth to their places of worship, they had no thought of imminent calamity. The ominous signs of such a possibility had escaped their attention. A few days before, Mrs. Jefferson Davis, with her children, had left Richmond for the South, and sent a part of her furniture to auction. So also, several weeks before, the horses remaining in the city had been impressed to collect the tobacco into convenient warehouses where it could be readily burned to prevent its falling into Yankee hands. But the significance of these and perhaps other indications could not be measured by the general populace. In fact, for some days a rather unusual quiet had prevailed. That morning Jefferson Davis was in his pew at St. Paul's Church, when, before the sermon was ended, an officer walked up the aisle and handed him a telegram from General Lee at Petersburg, dated at 10:30 that morning, in which he read, quote, "My lines are broken in 3 places. Richmond must be evacuated this evening." Unquote. He rose and left the church, whereupon the officer handed the telegram to the rector, who as speedily as possible brought the services to a close, making the announcement that General Ewell, the commander at Richmond, desired the military forces to assemble at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The news seems also to have reached in some form 1 or 2 of the other churches, so that though no announcement of the fact was made, the city little by little became aware of the impending change. The fact of its being Sunday, with no business going on and rest pervading every household, doubtless served to moderate the shock to the public. Yet very soon the scene was greatly transformed. From the Sabbath stillness of the morning, the streets became alive with bustle and activity. Jefferson Davis had called his cabinet and officials together, and the hurried packing of the Confederate archives for shipment was soon in progress. Citizens who had the means made hasty preparations for flight. The far greater number who were compelled to stay were in a flutter to devise measures of protection or concealment. The banks were opened, and depositors flocked thither to withdraw their money and valuables. A remnant of the Virginia legislature gathered in the Representatives' Hall at the Capitol to debate a question of greater urgency than had ever before taxed their wisdom or eloquence. In another room sat the Municipal Council, for once impressed with the full weight of its responsibility. Meanwhile the streets were full of hurrying people, of loaded wagons, of galloping military officers conveying orders. One striking sketch of that wild hurry-scurry deserves to be recorded. Quote, Lumpkin, who for many years had kept a slave trader's jail, also had a work of necessity on hand, 50 men, women, and children, who must be saved to the missionary institution for the future enlightenment of Africa. Although it was the Lord's day, perhaps he was comforted by the thought that, the better the day, the better the deed. The coffle gang was made up in the jail yard, within pistol shot of Davis's parlor window, within a stone's throw of the monumental church, and a sad and weeping throng, chained 2 and 2, the last slave coffle that shall ever tread the streets of Richmond, were hurried to the Danville depot. Unquote. But the institution, like the Confederacy, was already in extremis. The account adds that the departing trains could afford no transportation for this last slave cargo, and the gang went to pieces, like every other Richmond organization, military and political. Evening had come, and the confusion of the streets found its culmination at the railroad depots. Military authority made room for the fleeing president and his cabinet, and department officials and their boxes of more important papers. The cars were overcrowded and overloaded long before the clamoring multitude and piles of miscellaneous baggage could be got aboard, and by the occasional light of lanterns flitting hither and thither, the wheezing and coughing trains moved out into the darkness. The legislature of Virginia and the governor of the state departed in a canal boat towards Lynchburg. All available vehicles carrying fugitives were leaving the city by various country roads, but the great mass of the population, unable to get away, had to confront the dread certainty that only one night remained before the appearance of a hostile army with the power of death and destruction over them and their homes. How this power might be exercised, present signs were none too reassuring. Since noon, when the fact of evacuation had become certain, the whole fabric of society seemed to be crumbling to pieces. Military authority was concentrating its energy on only 2 objects, destruction and departure. The civil authority was lending a hand for the single hasty precaution which the city council could ordain was that all the liquors in the city should be emptied out. To order this was one thing. To have it rigorously executed would be asking quite too much of the lower human appetites. And while some of the street gutters ran with alcohol, enough was surreptitiously consumed to produce a frightful state of excitement and drunkenness. No picture need be drawn of the possibilities of violence and crime which must have haunted the timid watchers in Richmond, who listened all night to the shouts, the blasphemy, the disorder that rose and fell in the streets, or who furtively noted the signs of pillage already begun. And how shall we follow their imagination, passing from these acts of the friends of yesterday to what they might look for from the enemies expected tomorrow? And there was that final horror of horrors. The Negro soldiers, held up to their dread by the presidential message of Jefferson Davis only 2 weeks before. What now of the fear of servile insurrection, the terrible specter they had secretly nursed from their very childhood? It is scarcely possible they can have escaped such meditations, even though already weary and exhausted with the surprises and labors of the day, with the startling anxieties of the evening, with the absorbing care of burying their household silver and secreting their yet more precious personal ornaments and tokens of affection. In Europe, 1,000 wars have rendered such experiences historically commonplace. In America, let us hope that 1,000 years of peace may render their repetition impossible. Full of dangerous portent as had been the night, the morning became yet more ominous. Long before day, sleepers and watchers alike were startled by a succession of explosions, which shook every building. The military authorities were blowing up the vessels in construction at the river. These were 9 in number, 3 of them ironclads of 4 guns each, the others small wooden ships. Next, the arsenal was fired, and as many thousands of loaded shells were stored here, there succeeded for a period the sounds of a continuous cannonade. Already fire had been set to the warehouses containing the collected tobacco and cotton, among which loaded shells had also been scattered to ensure more complete destruction. There is a conflict of testimony as to who is responsible for the deplorable public calamity which ensued. The rebel Congress had passed a law ordering the government tobacco and other public property to be burned, and Jefferson Davis states that the general commanding had advised with the mayor and city authorities about precautions against a conflagration. On the other hand, Lieutenant General Ewell, the military commander, has authorized the statement that he not only earnestly warned the city authorities of the certain consequences of the measure, but that he took the responsibility of disobeying the law and military orders. "I left the city about 7 o'clock in the morning," he writes. "As yet nothing had been fired by my orders, yet the buildings and depot near the railway bridge were on fire, and the flames were so close as to be disagreeable as I rode by them." By this time the spirit of lawlessness and hunger for pillage had gained full headway. The rear guard of the retreating Confederates set the 3 great bridges in flames, and while the fire started at the 4 immense warehouses and various points, and soon uniting in an uncontrollable conflagration, was beginning to eat out the heart of the city, a miscellaneous mob went from store to store, and with a beam for a battering ram, smashed in the doors, so that the crowd might freely enter and plunder the contents. This rapacity, first directed towards bread and provision stores, gradually extended itself to all other objects until mere greed of booty, rather than need or usefulness, became the ruling instinct, and promoted the waste and destruction of that which had been stolen. Into this pandemonium of fire and license there came one additional terror to fill up its dramatic completeness. "About 10 o'clock," writes an eyewitness, "just before the entrance of the Federal army, a cry of dismay rang all along the streets which were out of the track of the fire, and I saw a crowd of leaping, shouting demons, in party-colored clothes and with heads half shaven. It was the convicts from the penitentiary, who had overcome the guard, set fire to the prison, and were now at liberty. Many a heart which had kept its courage to this point quailed at the sight. Fortunately, they were too intent upon securing their freedom to do much damage. It is quite probable that the magnitude and rapidity of the disaster served in a measure to mitigate its evil results. The burning of 700 buildings, comprising the entire business portion of Richmond, warehouses, manufactories, mills, depots, and stores, all within the brief space of a day, was a visitation so sudden, so unexpected, so stupefying, as to overawe and terrorize even wrongdoers, and made the harvest of plunder so abundant as to serve to scatter the mob and satisfy its rapacity to quick repletion. Before a new hunger could arise, assistance, protection, and relief were at hand. The mayor and citizens committee who went forth met General Weitzel a little before 7 o'clock in the morning, near Gillis Creek, outside the limits of Richmond, where a detachment of Union pickets, numbering 60 or 70 men, under command of Lieutenant Royal B. Prescott, had also arrived. Here an informal surrender took place, a ceremony which was repeated with more formality in the capital at a later hour. This incident over, the general and his staff proceeded into the city, followed by Lieutenant Prescott and his force, and preceded by a squad of the general's orderlies from the 4th Massachusetts Cavalry, commanded by Major A. H. Stevens, and established headquarters in the house lately occupied by Jefferson Davis. Lieutenant Prescott reached Capitol Square soon after 7 o'clock. At that hour there was no flag flying, but Major Stevens soon arrived and hoisted 2 cavalry guidons over the State House. Meanwhile, from the meeting at Gillis Creek, and probably on information gathered from the mayor, General Weitzel had sent an aide back with orders to get the 1st Brigade he could find and bring it in to act as provost guard. This proved to be General E. H. Ripley's brigade of General Charles Devens' division of the 24th Army Corps. The brigade was headed by General Devens, with the 13th New Hampshire Volunteers as its leading regiment, and marched into the city with colors flying and bands playing, reaching the Capitol grounds a little after 8 o'clock, from where the forces were sent in various directions on the urgent duties of the hour. Soon afterward, there occurred what was to the inhabitants the central incident of the day, the event which engrossed their solicitude even more than the vanished rebel government, the destroyed city, or the lost cause. General Weitzel's direction calling in the provost guard had been accompanied by another that all the rest of his troops should remain outside the city to take possession of the inner line of redoubts. This second order, however, failed to reach the 5th Massachusetts Cavalry, a colored regiment under command of Colonel Charles Francis Adams, posted on the extreme right of the Union line, who instead obeyed an earlier request from General Devens to advance into the city, and this colored regiment, therefore, led by a grandson of President John Quincy Adams, shared with the 6 white regiments of General Ripley's brigade the honor of a march into the rebel capital on the day of its surrender. The arrival of these colored soldiers was to the people of Richmond the visible realization of the new order to which 4 years of rebellion and war had brought them. The prejudices of a lifetime cannot be instantly overcome, and the rebels of Richmond doubtless felt that this was the final drop in their cup of misery, and that their subjugation was complete. It is related that about this time, as by a common impulse, the white people of Richmond disappeared from the streets, and the black population streamed forth with an apparently instinctive recognition that their day of jubilee had at last arrived. To see this compact, organized body of men of their own color, on horseback, in neat uniforms, with flashing sabers, with the gleam of confidence and triumph in their eyes, was a palpable living reality to which their hope and pride, long repressed, gave instant response. They greeted them with expressions of welcome in every form, cheers, shouts, laughter, and a rattle of exclamations, as they rushed along the sides of the streets to keep pace with the advancing column and feast their eyes on the incredible sight, while the black Union soldiers rose high in their stirrups and with waving swords and deafening huzzas acknowledged the fraternal reception. But there was little time for holiday enjoyment. The conflagration was roaring, destruction was advancing, fury of fire, blackness of smoke, crash of falling walls, obstruction of debris, confusion, helplessness, danger, seemed everywhere. The great Capitol Square on the hill had become the refuge of women and children and the temporary storing place of the few household effects they had saved from the burning. From this center, where the stars and stripes again floated, there now flowed back upon the stricken city not the doom and devastation for which its people looked, but the friendly help and protection of a generous army, bringing them peace, and the spirit of a benevolent government tendering them forgiveness and reconciliation. Up to this time it would seem that not an organization had been proposed, and but feeble efforts made, to stay the ravages of the flames. The public spirit of Richmond was crushed by the awful catastrophe. The advent of the Union Army breathed a new life into this social paralysis. The first care of the officers was to organize resistance to fire, to reestablish order and personal security, and convert the unrestrained mob of whites and blacks into a regulated energy, to save what remained of the city from the needless burning and pillage to which its own friends had devoted it, against remonstrance and against humanity. And this was not all. Beginning that afternoon, and continuing many days, these Yankee invaders fed the poor of Richmond and saved them from starvation to which the law of the Confederate Congress, relentlessly executed by the Confederate President and some of his subordinates, exposed them. End of chapter 10. Recording by Warren Cotty, Gurnee, Illinois.